Good afternoon and welcome to EdSurge Live, where we explore big questions facing higher education. And I don't think we've had a bigger emergency raising questions than COVID-19. And we also in this forum give you a chance to add your perspectives and your questions. I'm Jeff Young, an editor and reporter here at EdSurge. And I will be moderating today with Bryan Alexander, who I'll introduce in a minute. And we're talking, this is part 2 of what is now a weekly series we'll keep doing as long as we feel it's needed, on how colleges should respond to the coronavirus. As we did last week, Bryan Alexander, if you don't know him already, he runs a wonderful forum every week. He's a consultant and futurist around EdTech. And his forum, the Future Trends Forum, is a discussion that takes place every Thursday afternoon. I recommend that if you don't know of it already. Even after this emergency is over, people should check that out. And I want to quickly also introduce the other guests we have with us today for today's installment. First off, Sean Gallagher at Northeastern University, where he runs the Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy. He is a columnist for EdSurge. I love to work with him in that role, but also he has this excellent view of the landscape of how higher ed is changing. Sean, thank you for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And Noah Pickus, who is at Duke University, as the associate provost and a senior advisor there. Duke, as we'll get to in the session, is doing a lot of innovative adjustments to bolster online education and make an institutional response during this the disruptions of this pandemic. Thank you, Noah, for joining us.
Thanks, appreciate it, Jeff.
And we also, I'm excited to say, have Barbara Oakley, a professor of engineering at Oakland University, but she teaches one of, I think it might be the most popular free online course ever taught, which is, I've also gotten to see a lot of. It's fantastic. It's called Learning How to Learn. And so she has this really interesting perspective into online learners who have been doing this for a while and into the process of teaching online to a very broad audience. Barb, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So now, the format of this is we're going to try to open this up to questions as soon as we can. Bryan and I are going to ask some questions to get us started of our panelists, but we really count on the participants to be part of this, and it's been working great. So if you want to ask a question, click on the raise hand icon or use the chat window, and we have some folks from EdSurge in the chat who are going to help kind of traffic cop who's coming up here, and we'd love to have you ask your question via video, or you can do it by audio. But having those voices come forward is key to this whole format and what makes it special and gives us some flavor of the kind of in-person gathering we can't do right now because of this COVID. So Bryan, maybe let's start things off with a little quick update on like where are we at? Things have changed so much.
Things have changed and things just keep changing. And as well, the data is sometimes uncertain. So what we can find right now is that worldwide, we have about over 400,000 tested infections. The death toll has climbed to nearly 19,000. The US has a small but growing fraction of that, based primarily in New York City area. In higher education, we have roughly half, at least, of higher education has gone through the process of closing face-to-face instruction and shifting online in different ways and to different degrees, with dorms open or closed and different timelines. But we've really made that move in an incredible hurry. It seems like one angle of this now is that the United States Congress is wrangling to come up with some kind of aid or stimulus package that has certain implications for higher education. Last news item I saw said that the Democrats are pushing for a $10,000 payment to each person who owes school loans, and the Republicans are blocking that right now. There is also the overall problem that the economy is in a terrible, terrible state, plummeting rapidly, and that this has all kinds of implications for higher education, everything from the jobs our students have to the funding that comes from state governments. So we are definitely in an extraordinary crisis moment right now, and it's one that's just continuing to develop faster and faster.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. I mean, last week on our session we did with a couple of different guests, we talked a lot about the kind of like teaching and how to make teaching at colleges as equitable as possible when you're making this turn on a dime in a way that some people give colleges a bad rep sometimes for moving slowly, but here's a time where that there's a very fast movement. So this week we wanted to start off by digging in a little bit to more of the institution level response, but also like thinking through with help of folks like Sean, like what this might even mean, and all of our guests, like what this may mean for higher ed once, hopefully, once things change, get back to somewhat like normal as far as the health issues we face. Noah, I wanted to see if we could start really quickly with you maybe and talk very briefly about how Duke has done some unusual things with trying to spin up some online courses or draw on some online materials as you've had this change to online learning.
Sure. I'm not sure how unusual we are. I think everyone is doing this right now. And there's been, it's one of the remarkable things about higher education that we've always seen, where you say to somebody, can I come see your source code? And they say, sure. That they're just come visit. We do that all the time. And that's been exponential here in terms of all the crowdsourcing and sharing of information. Duke had one advantage, which is I also serve as a dean at Duke Kunshan University, which is our joint venture in China with our partner is Wuhan University. We're not located in Wuhan, but we're in outside of Shanghai. And we went online there February 24th. So we've been online for 4 weeks. We have 10 lessons we've learned from that. I can drop it into the chat if people want to see that.
Please do. I'm sure people will.
So essentially, Duke had a trial run with our global platform to go online and figure this out immediately. I think that both for DKU in China and for Duke, there have been a couple of aspects. One is to set clearly what your guiding principles are. Principles like high quality, maximum equity, flexibility, community, and be super prescriptive about the broad policy decisions that need to get made, and then super attentive to a decentralized deans and divisional leaders and chairs and individual faculty for trusting them in the implementation of this. We had something like at Duke yesterday, which is the first day we went online, we had something like, I'm trying to think the number of classes. We had, I think, 28,000 or 30,000 students during the day. We had something like, so you're talking about 5,000 or 6,000 classes going on all at once. And so far, lots of glitches, lots of here's and there, but also a lot of faculty and students finding very quickly that things are going well.
And, go ahead, Bryan.
No, that's terrific. I mean, Noah, this is a tremendous achievement, being able to do this. I mean, overall now, I mean, does the community still support this? Is the morale high?
The morale is remarkably high. I've never seen messages from so many faculty about feeling held and feeling supported, both being trusted to do this, but also getting the message and the tone right. At Duke, we stood up 3 websites right away: Keep Teaching, Keep Learning, and Keep Working. And one for staff, one for faculty, one for students. There's some shared information across this, but we have multiple FAQs going. We have lots of advice. It started with the technical advice, right? How do I use Zoom? Those kinds of things. But another big takeaway from this experience has been, and maybe one that is going to be the most long lasting, is that learning innovation isn't about the technology. It's actually about learning innovation. And that what we find faculty who were initially concerned about having to go online, even suspicious, is that it's giving them an opportunity to actually think more intentionally about their teaching, to bring in a few new twists. But I think people feel that they are part of an important mission to serve their students, and that they are actually excited about this collective effort to do that. And to focus on teaching and learning. And the debate over the technology is fading away in terms of I do or I don't want to do this. It's more, well, what's helpful to learning? And let's think about the ways we can do that. So the mood is good.
Thank you. And I'm glad to hear it. That's a very, very significant achievement. And that last point is really, really critical, I think. The focus is on education and learning rather than on technology per se.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, because it is, even after a lot of people saying that over the years, it does seem to default. I mean, here at EdSearch, where we cover tech and education, we increasingly don't like to say the tech part, because I think it raises the questions. The work that people are doing that happens to be with tech is really raising questions beyond that. They're sort of most interestingly approached from a teaching or solving some other problem perspective. Sean, I wanted to sort of draw on your knowledge of especially kind of some alternate forms of higher ed that were already going strong, like like everything from badges and alternate credentials, and working with employers like Northeastern does. What do you think? Do you think some of those things will kind of how are they being used now, I guess, first off, because I think we're all living in the now first before we get to some future thoughts. Like, what do you see the impact of some of these other things that have been kind of floating around, like micro credentials or things you've been written about and done work in this moment?
Sure. Yeah, it's certainly difficult to forecast until we start to see some changes in practice and data, but certainly what we do know is that we've had a major economic pivot, unfortunately, just in terms of the rapid forced slowdown of the economy in the US and around the world. That's likely to result in a few million jobs lost, just in terms of what we might see next week. And perhaps it'll get worse after that. So I think very quickly we've gone from a seller's market for talent to kind of a new situation. And thankfully, in terms of some of the policy discussion and what you might call a bailout or a stimulus, like a stimulus would probably be the best word. There's attention to how do we support workers and consumers and companies, and what are their policies. And so very rapidly, there's just a lot more happening in terms of more telework, more digital work. Likewise, I think most employee development and training, which was already largely online, that's having to be done online. And I think we're all, right, being in most states being forced to work at home. If you hadn't embraced it already, we're now in a situation where work and life and education are starting to blur. It's a very gross high-level measure, but one thing I've been looking at for a few days, if not a week or two now, is Google Trends, and trying to see, is there any early evidence that people are searching for new sorts of things, micro-credentials, online degrees? We'll have to see, and I know many organizations would have proprietary data on this that they might be able to share, but it does look like there's perhaps a bit of an uptick that we're getting, right? Because you're at home, you suddenly have some time on your hands, perhaps. Maybe you're not going to that conference, or things are slowing down in some aspects of life, and maybe you're thinking about investing in a new degree or a new credential. But at the same time, it's pretty difficult to say exactly where things will head. Overall, the thing I'd underscore, if it's not obvious, is when we come out of this, which we will, we're going to see some major changes, long-term changes in consumer behavior, worker behavior, employer behavior. And it's nice to see people and organizations coming together and thinking globally. And that's something that we'll have to study. I tend to do a lot of research and look at trends and what's changing. And this is a moment of dramatic change. And so everything we're measuring from here on out we really need to collect some new data and get some new perspectives, which is, the beauty of this type of forum.
Thanks. Yeah, I definitely hear that. And Sean, we're actually hearing a little bit of that. We're sort of trying to see if there's an uptick in some of these online offerings, the sort of low cost offerings. And I'm starting to get a little bit of a sense that it's yes, although obviously we're very beginning of something. Barbara Oakley, I wonder if you could weigh in a little bit on that too. I mean, you teach learning how to learn, and you have done that for several years now. And I also know that a lot of people may not realize, but you are in touch with even past learners from your course. And so now you have like a mailing list that is like hundreds of thousands of people that you send a note to. So it seems like you're kind of aware of what these kind of students who have taken these online courses are kind of like, that you have a little bit of a finger on the pulse there. Do you have anything to add to what Sean's talking about, or what do you see as like some of the potential impact for some of these mass online courses or other kind of forms of online education that kind of are outside of the traditional institutions?
Well, it is kind of funny because I send out an email to almost 2 million people each week, my Cheery Friday email, and I do get feedback, and it helps me to have a finger on the pulse of what's going on in learners, and particularly in instructors, both in academia, in business, and in K-12 industries. It seemed to me that about 2 weeks ago, there was a feeling of pure terror as all of a sudden instructors of every ilk were, you're going to go online on Monday. And now what I sense is, surprisingly, it's sort of what Noah was saying. There's almost a feeling of exhilaration. It's a strange time for all of us because many of us are thrown into the bathwater all at the same time. So when we're making mistakes in doing Zoom calls or something, it's like, yeah, well, we're all learning this stuff. And so there's almost this shared joy as we're learning about these things. But I just get this sense of excitement from teachers who've often been teaching the same old thing in the same old way for the same old number of years. And all of a sudden, they can't do it that way anymore. And they're actually kind of excited about it. One thing I do think is going to happen out of this, we know that, for example, our grandparents who lived through the Great Depression had a completely different attitude about things like food and money than we did, because they didn't have much food and they didn't have much money. I do think that what we're going to see coming out of this in academia, I remember I would go around, I'd give a presentation about the importance of online learning, and in it, it would say, it will harden the education system against things like public national disasters, epidemics, and so forth. And you could see audiences looking at me going, she's just a prepper. And you just couldn't convince them that actually online learning is really an important part of the educational arsenal that does harden our infrastructure and make it so it's really viable no matter what comes at us. I think from now on, you will see much more awareness on the part of educational institutions that, hey, we do need to have our system hardened. And I think the most important thing from my perspective is people are switching over sort of grudgingly to synchronous forms of teaching. But the really more adventurous teachers are also venturing into asynchronous methods. And with asynchronous, you can have more time to prepare something that's really good and also kind of takes advantage of economies of scale. So my hope is that we'll see both synchronous, but also more asynchronous sort of migration into online learning.
That's a terrific answer. And I have to say, Barb, I've been down that same route myself, mentioning threats like pandemics and getting all kinds of weird sighs and eyeballs being raised. but I envy you, your class. If you look through the chat box, you'll see just many people saying they love your Friday emails. They really loved your class. I mean, you've got a lot of fans here.
Oh, well, that's nice. It's funny because I spend a lot of time on those Cheery Friday emails, and I do them all myself, but I love writing them in third person so that I can make fun of myself.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Also in the chat, we've had a lot of questions about the economics of this, everything from how much does it cost to offer an online class to what's going to happen to campuses as this crisis continues to proceed. And I wanted to circle back to Sean and your comments just a couple of minutes ago. Did you find that we should be expecting state governments and the federal government to be, in the US especially, to be enduring serious revenue shortfalls from taxes? And if so, how is that going to play out in terms of, say, the public financing of higher ed?
Yeah, presumably that's ahead. There's some other variables though. For instance, if you look at interest rates, right? Extremely low rate, zero rate environment right now suddenly. And so as a result, student loans are, and there's not a lot of fans of student loans out there for the most part. Certainly there's a lot we need to do to address student debt issues and defaults and all that, but that's of course a key mechanism. And rates have dropped very significantly. Likewise, the borrowing market, right? A lot of colleges have expanded through debt. And yet at the same time, from what I understand, and I'm not a financial expert per se versus a generalist, riskier debt is now that much more riskier and higher priced. And so it may be harder for many colleges to borrow to expand in the way that they did. I did a survey back in the Great Recession, so this was 11 or 12 years ago. We happened to have this big national survey going out at the moment that the stock market was collapsing, the housing market, all of it. And certainly what we saw at that time was that people, to Barb's point, they reported, this was a very large national sample of adult learners, which is the audience that I tend to focus on more than the traditional students in a lot of my work. They were much more cost and price sensitive. But at the same time, the difficult economy was prompting them to consider, wow, I really should finish my bachelor's degree or get a graduate degree. And so I think a lot of us in higher ed have been thinking about that counter-cyclical nature of higher ed. But historically, that's been the case because it's at times a question of, well, do I wait the economy out in law school or business school and then go back even stronger and the economy will have recovered? Or, we just don't know, I think, what sorts of jobs and opportunities might be there. And it hasn't been at the same point where costs are very high. The last thing I'll say very quickly, and hopefully this doesn't become a tangent, but there's a lot woven in here when you think about the finances and the pricing, is are we in a very sort of slow, deflationary sort of environment where it'll be more difficult for colleges to raise tuition prices, or they'll be expected to offer things in a sort of faster, cheaper way. And I think that starts to speak to what you could hypothesize about micro-credentials. Certainly it seems like it would be a benefit for people to have the option to get something quicker and less expensive that's modular and then stacks into a degree rather than have to make an all-in choice about a degree or not. And that of course though is pretty speculative.
That actually is a good segue into a questioner we have already from the audience, Julie, and we could bring Julie up. And just, I want others that, I think people are very active already in the chat, so it's wonderful. And you might hear from Michael Sano or Becky Koenig from EdSurge asking you if you want to come join us for asking a question. So go ahead and please be doing that now, because we definitely want to make this an interactive forum, and that's where the strength of this system comes in. So Julie, do we have, Michael, do we have Julie available to ask her question? There she is. Hi, Julie. There's so many people on the screen here. I had to scroll over. Well, thank you so much for joining us again, and please share your question for our group here.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My question was more for Sean. Hi, Sean. I was wondering if you think that alternative credential market is strong enough from a policy perspective to actually be an option when we look at this educational stimulus that we might see. I'm going back to my time when I lived in Michigan, and around, the Great Recession hit Michigan a lot earlier than most states. And so what we were seeing is folks that tended to move into higher ed once they lost their positions elsewhere and they really wanted to finish those degrees. I'm curious if you think that there's the same level of trust that our states have in our state institutions, and our feds, at the folks at the federal level seem to have in alternative credentials, at least in what we've seen in recent policy moves. If you think that there's something there around perhaps state stimulus and alternative credentials, if you think that that market's stable enough to actually be an option for any educational stimulus package we might see.
Yeah, it's a great question. Try to answer it briefly. I could certainly see, so when we think about stimulus, right, are we now rebuilding infrastructure and manufacturing in different ways than we might have assumed weeks ago? Are we skilling up healthcare workers or investing more in life science and other areas? I think in the congressional discussion, it's the Green New Deal types of ideas are being inserted in there. So if there's sort of some bold new workforce directions that come out of this, certainly I could see favoring what are programs that might be offered by colleges, but could be alternatives to colleges or not traditional long degrees because it takes so long for people to earn them and go through a longer program, to skill up the workforce quickly in a nimble way. That said, I don't know that if we just rewind a few weeks or a few months that the micro-credential market is mature enough and developed enough or really driven by state or even federal policy. It's much more of like an open, private, Wild West sort of environment that was still emerging. So it's hard to say exactly how it will tie to future policy directions. But what we're already seeing in terms of waivers of federal requirements for seat time for international students, and likewise with various forms of online study. And then I think I saw something just as this session began that the US Department of Education, so this would have to be fact checked, just sort of scrolled across my screen moments ago, is now, for example, allowing virtual accreditation visits to count. And so what this crisis is clearly doing is it's testing which things need to be in person and which things can be online, and encouraging some innovation. So if we do see policy waivers, maybe we'll see cases where a degree would have been preferenced or required, and a micro-credential can sort of step in instead.
And Sean, you did see that. It was on CHIA's newsletter that just came out that virtual accreditation visits are now allowed.
All right, yeah.
This just in.
Julie, which newsletter was that?
The Council for Higher Ed Accreditation, CHEA. Their newsletter came out, I don't know, maybe within the hour, and that was one of their items, was that virtual accreditation visits were now allowed. I don't know if it's time bound or anything like that, but and honestly, I didn't read it, but I know it's in there.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that, and Sean, thank you for the very, very thoughtful and detailed answer. I mean, it's possible that all kinds of changes could be driven through this. But we've also seen some of these challenges actually, or some of these changes play out. Noah, you were doing some work with Coursera to try to get more online course content from them or with them. How'd that play out?
So when we went online in China, one of the things that Matthew Raskoff here worked out with Coursera was, and now it's available much more widely, was to access their full course catalog, not just the Duke courses, for a limited period of time, so that if we have a faculty member who has to do chemistry lectures and has never worked in this environment, rather than have him or her record an hour and a half lecture 4 days a week, there might be high quality 6-minute lectures that you can find in a Coursera course and repurpose. So it wasn't using, we found our students actually did some of the Coursera courses anyway, because they were interested. but mostly it was a way of repurposing and mashing up available materials with what we had already. And in part that, I mean, that speaks to both the way a lot of companies and educational institutions are collaborating. But I saw in the chat there was another comment that I think this relates to, which is the questions of accessibility to students in the current situation. And I think about that at least in two ways. I mean, the first thing at Duke, we've tried to think about this in terms of first aid rather than long-term care, right? This is, Sean Miller in Learning Innovation here has focused us on, let's keep the technology simple, let's focus on the students' needs, and let's manage through this and not confuse what we're doing with long-term, highly designed courses. Now, as I said earlier, we've been really surprised pleasantly by how the high quality we're getting, but it's not designed for everybody in mind, every user. We've spent a lot of time paying attention to time zones and the mix, James Janone pointed this out in the chat, of asynchronous and synchronous learning. And that we started with a lot of asynchronous, now we've blended in more synchronous, but always paying attention to both time zones and when students can access and how we can reach out to them to find that out. We're using Microsoft Teams now so that we have a lot of contact going on. And in Zoom, using the closed captioning technology. So it's never going to be the highest quality UDL that we want, but there is a lot that's going on if you just ask people to pay attention to it because they care about it.
Glad to have that background. Thank you. Thank you. We have more questions that are just streaming through the chat box right now. In fact, we had some interesting arguments about accessibility, and they've come from a few different angles. One is the, if you will, the formal part of accessibility, to what extent content is available for people with various disabilities. I mean, Noah, you mentioned, for example, closed captioning. And then there's the other sense of equity. Can people who may not have either the infrastructure or the preparation to participate, can they do this? Lizzie has this wonderful, important note. We need to make sure that supports are in place for students who are struggling. Students who struggle with in-person higher education environments will also struggle, probably more, in online learning environments. That doesn't have to be the case.
Well, Brian, one thing that folks might want to talk about here has been I'm not sure if the word is widespread to call this yet, but the number of institutions that have adopted some form of pass-fail opportunities. That doesn't go to the support of issue that Liz is raising, because that's obviously significant, but it's a way of trying to respond to that concern. Different schools have taken different tacks. I can tell you, when you're in one school, whatever you adopt, you will get a lot of feedback about what's wrong with it. And then you'll see a different policy adopted elsewhere. So it is hard to find the right mix, and different mixes will fit different localities. But I think that is a response. But what's unknown in this moment right now is to what degree will employers, will graduate schools in particular, given Sean's earlier comments, will they say simply, this is an unprecedented time, we are going to hold harmless all the students for what happens here? And that raises, and it's not clear yet how that's being played out from medical or law or other schools, even though they're passing these policies themselves for their current students. And so there's both a good policy response going on, but like everything we see right now, when you drill down, a lot of uncertainty.
Oh. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, Brian. I think that was I really appreciate the answer. I think we have another audience question. Brian, did you want to tell us about that one?
Yeah, we've had some questions about how do you different parts of the curriculum. So it's one thing to transfer, say, a history class seminar or lecture online, but it's another to try to work with labs that require physical work with your hands, everything from, say, diesel technology to surgery. And we had different people with questions about this. I think, Leah, you want to talk about that.
Hello, my name is Leah Benamy. I am the Director of Learning at C-Space. Apologies for my colorful graphic. I forgot to change it before joining. But I just wanted to ask a little bit. I've been hearing from some students on lab courses and you know, how are institutions adjusting for that? Because I know how challenging it is to have that experiential component when you're working with different pieces of equipment and chemicals and whatnot. So I just wanted to hear what people have been doing to adapt. Thank you.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I would love to hear from at least two of our guests, from Barb and Noah. Are you seeing virtual labs? Are you seeing people putting those off for the fall semester? Or what kind of solutions are you seeing in play?
One thing that I've heard of that I thought was quite interesting was there is a major national problem with irreproducibility in science. So journal papers that are published and then for any number of reasons, too small of a sample size, bias, whatever, it cannot be reproduced. So there are real problems. I was at National Institutes of Health last year as they were attempting to create massive open online courses and an online platform to help start educating researchers about how to do better research. So one of the things I thought was very interesting is that some lab course instructors have taken this opportunity to say, well, you know, we can't get them in actually, you know, burning and seeing how many calories come off of this particular experiment, but we can step back a little bit and give our students some understanding of how to do good research and how bad research can happen. So they're not actually getting their hands on in that particular set of labs necessarily, but they're getting this other really good information that we are not generally teaching. And I just thought, well, you know, it's a bit of a stopgap. It's not what we expect, but actually it's a very innovative way of trying to tackle labs in a time when it's really hard to do labs.
Interesting. How would you please go ahead.
Bryan, I can echo that. I think, and I dropped into the chat some of our FAQ on remote labs. Leah, I think that we've seen a lot of focus on remote lab opportunities, on doing virtual labs. It is a different kind of education, but I think there's a lot, you know, we've been developing these tools. People have been working on these, and now all of a sudden, they're ready and people are finding them. It's a big adjustment. I think but we're seeing a lot of emphasis there. The other question you raised, which is to the degree to which there are, if you think about a lab having two different dimensions, one is the sort of experiential aspect of learning this, and the other is sort of learning how to do some of the technical parts, which in principle could be done in a boot camp version, right? What you actually need to know doesn't have to be done in a 3-hour lab in that way. I think universities are figuring this out. They're trying to do the virtual labs now, and then trying to figure out how they can make this up if they can at later times. I don't know that there's a single one-size-fits-all response to that, but we're seeing the two tracks happening.
Great.
Thank you so much, Leah, for that question. That was wonderful. Thank you for joining us. So, you know, one of the things that I really like about that question, and it's a theme that kind of came up for me for a second there that I'm curious about for the panelists, is what, you know, what is it in higher ed that just can't be done, you know, online? And, you know, there obviously are some research I'm hearing. I've heard the other day about a researcher who lost their entire PhD thesis research because the plants they were supposed to be tending, or that they were to tend, like couldn't be tended during the, you know, during this crisis because the building was shut. So what are things that kind of cannot be replaced, or is anything, I don't know, or is there just some, maybe even that could be done in some home game? Also, we have this poll up, which Barb challenged us before the formal session to try this. So we're going to do that in the spirit of trying the tools. But I'm curious if like maybe Barbara first, like what, is there something that have you found maybe cannot be done as well online, or some part of the university world that can't move online?
Well, one thing that kind of makes me laugh is that STEM professors do tend to feel more comfortable around the technology. And I think as a consequence of that, it's a little easier for them to often put their courses online. And those in the humanities and social sciences, they can be very comfortable with technology, but it's a little less likely than those who are already in STEM. So those professors often, if they're not as comfortable, they often say, well, you just cannot teach my discipline online. I'm sorry, but this history, there's just no way you could convey this, or this whatever. And it's actually not true at all. It only has to do with the fact that that particular professor is not as comfortable going online, because I can guarantee you that you can have more fun with the humanities and social sciences, actually, in many ways, than you can with STEM disciplines when you put them online. So I think though that most disciplines, I think you can put online, and you can make fantastic courses. You just need good professors who are kind of vested in putting them out. But that said, there are some kinds of equipment that are really expensive, that it's going to be pretty hard to, especially if it's a small number of learners, to create the kinds of materials that could, actually be cost effective to teach numbers of students with. So there are very specific, small number of student sorts of things that it is really hard to teach. And I think those we're just kind of grappling with. I think most of the time there is a way, but it can be very expensive.
Sean, do you have any thoughts on, what can't, and it kind of gets at that question of like what, I think the idea of accreditation being done online is an interesting, kind of news flash that came in while we talked. But are there parts of the process in higher ed that really just need to be done in person?
Yeah, well, certainly it varies by discipline at times, right? We could name healthcare or, vocational programs and other things. I think it's a bit of a spectrum in terms of there are areas and aspects of learning that can be done very well and arguably better online. And in other cases, you lose something, whether it's something that's collaborative or hands-on. Certainly the research enterprise of universities, which we might look at as a very separate mission, but we talked about it in terms of labs, virtual labs. There's machinery and experiments and tests and things that you can't very rapidly move online. So at Northeastern, at least, that was one of the last things to sort of shut down. And I think there is even some continuity in certain projects, but keeping that research enterprise going. A special challenge that we've had at my university is that we also have students who are out in the world of employment, and thousands of students who are doing cooperative education placements, in addition to those that are studying abroad. So there's another thing, right, where the whole sort of ethos and frame of it is, well, I'm going to go learn and study somewhere else. Okay, all of a sudden you can't be abroad. So those are maybe some obvious examples, but if we were to kind of break down by student audience or by discipline or however we chose to slice and dice it, you do get great variation in terms of what can work online and what can't. And the thing that I really wonder about is for most traditional students, traditional age students who are enrolling in a campus-based experience because that's really what they prefer. Now, of course, many students prefer some kind of blended experience. There's a solid population who is very disinterested in online education. And so we've moved things online very rapidly, which is tremendous to watch, as I think we've talked about. It's a real accomplishment if it's working and if the outcomes are there. But, you know, is there some backlash that happens, like we saw a little bit with MOOCs years ago, where because these experiences, it's an emergency. Certainly it's an emergency, but they weren't designed and staged in advance. You know, we have to be careful about how does that shape perception, especially among students who tend to want that in-person experience and that coming of age experience. So I think it really varies based on the student population for sure, the demographic, if you will, and then also the type of discipline if we're talking about learning. But I've taught online, I've earned degrees online. Certainly a big fan of it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sean. And, you know, I was talking to a student just yesterday who just took her first online class. It was somebody at Emerson College in Boston, actually out at where you are, your neck of the woods there, Sean. But she was saying that some of her classes so far online are fine, you know, like or just seem like, you know, that she's getting the material well. Others, you know, like for whatever reason, you know, in one case, the professor of literature like didn't want to, you know, wasn't up to the tools, and so didn't end up using the tools and just make everybody just read the book and answer some questions from here on out. And she was disappointed with that. But it wasn't so much the format, it was really how it was being used. So maybe that's the flaw of the whole question in some way. I guess, you know, what could be done online? What's more like you said, there's some facilities issues of things that are absolutely in person, but there's and the coming of age part. I think that's a really interesting point too. We have an audience question that I want to get to. Matt Kelly, thanks for joining us, Matt.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the conversation here. I'm wondering what schools are doing with their alumni to support these students, whether that be in the curriculum, you know, involving them in the virtual learning, or, you know, through other means, especially with the class of 2020, you know, most likely not going to have official commencement ceremonies or have those postponed. You know, I'm wondering how alumni can be used here to really support these students as we go through this kind of new normal.
Anyone want to take that, Noah?
Well, only to strike out with it. I think that's one of those questions that as soon as somebody poses it, you say, oh yeah, that's right. We need to be thinking about that, but we're not caught up to that now. I mean, at Duke, we've been deeply involved for the last couple of years in thinking about like a lot of universities, right? We have Northeastern, Sean from Northeastern here, and you think about the work that they've done, and they think, you know, what's the phrase, the robot-proof future, and thinking about the 60-year curriculum and all of that. So there's been enormous attention to that, and how do we turn forms of continuing and online education into something that reaches the alumni in that way. Schools are at different stages of that. We're at a stage here where there's a lot of interest and focus on it, but right now we need to focus on this immediate kind of issue. I do think the thing that this will underscore, though, is what I said earlier, which is, and I see this in the chat, the best thing that could come out of this from a higher ed perspective, and we can all see the downsides. I mean, they're just enormous, and Sean has gone over a number of them in terms of equity and access and finance and the economy. But if there's a silver lining, it is that we would make this less an ideological argument than an experimental one, right? We're experimenting with different modes of delivery. They have pluses and minuses. I put in the chat, we have some low-tech strategies that work very well if that you're a humanities faculty member and this isn't to your liking, using more online kinds of things. And I think the point is that if this is a great opportunity to experiment with these issues rather than to have a 30,000-foot fight over what this means for the future of higher education.
Jeff, one more, just a related thought, Noah, is one company, I did have to mention that Coursera has put a lot of thought into outreach to alumni. So their new Coursera for Campus allows universities to actually reach out with courses specifically for alumni. And I've been shocked at there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest. And I think it's because people just leave the alumni out of the equation. And yet that's such an important part of any university's community. And what a great idea to build a structure that you can more easily reach out to them with quality material.
Thanks, Matt, for your question. Really appreciate it. All right, I think we're going to have one last audience question before we're getting near time. This always goes so fast, and certainly has today. I believe Liz is ready with the question as soon as we can push the buttons behind the scenes here. Bear with us one second. There she is. Hi, Liz. You're muted. It defaults mute. So if you unmute, Liz, you have a question here, and we are running low on time. So your fastest way to say it.
I can talk really fast. Can
Awesome.
Everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
So I'm guessing you're referring to my question about faculty like evaluation. Okay,
Yep,
good.
that's the one.
So this is a scary question, I think, to ask, because when I asked the technology coordinator this question, a university technology coordinator, they told me this is a terrible idea. But the question is, I know that realizing we have to give faculty a lot of grace at this time, moving forward, has there been any conversation in higher ed, and maybe this won't happen until later, about technology integration being part of faculty evaluation, proficiency in technology integration?
I don't know, Noah, do you want to tackle this?
I think it's a little like the response to Matt. Those are great questions that I think the current moment is throwing up. But right now, what everyone is focused on, certainly at the two institutions I'm working with, is the policy we've set, which is we are going to do teaching evaluations because we want to learn from this process, but we will again hold harmless the faculty. So all faculty can discount those evaluations from any review process. They will not be read unless they want them to, right? We want to collect information because we'd miss an enormous learning opportunity for people who are doing great things. But we need to signal to the vast majority of faculty that are asking them to step in and think about all this. And to your point, in many cases, integrate technology. This has to be a kind of experimental place where they can do it and not feel like they're going to be harmed as a result. That's where the focus is right now. And if we can send that message out, then they'll do more experimentations. We'll learn some good things from it. And I think it could lead to the kind of question that you're picking up on. But we need a longer runway to get to that question.
Liz, thanks so much. I think we're gonna, because we're just down to our last couple of minutes, Bryan, I think, is gonna kind of help us sort through what we just went through. Bryan, you have some thoughts?
I think that's. I want to thank Liz for the question. It's a remarkable question, and Noah, I love the idea of holding faculty harmless unless they want to be held to the evaluations, and that ties into all the other recent problems we've seen with evaluations. This past hour has roared past at top speed, and I just want to summarize a couple of the major topics that have come up. One of them is accessibility, and that is both in the form of design, as universal design for learning, as well as how to make higher education accessible to more and more students, including first-generation students, as well as those with infrastructure issues. We had some interesting ideas about certification and assessment. One was the idea that we may see micro-credentials become more widely used. Another was the shift to pass-fail, which Noah pointed out from his experience. We discussed financial pressures in multiple ways. The cost of going online, both to, what does it cost to offer an individual class, as well as what does it cost the whole institution to rapidly shunt online. As well as some of the side effects. I mean, Sean was mentioning downstream financial, macro financial issues we have to worry about, as well as the 2 cases today of 2 universities basically ending. We touched on labs, how to offer them, remote labs, or by focusing on non-lab issues like bad research. Barb pointed to the dumpster fire of scientific reproducibility going on now. We discussed the resistance to going online, including disciplinary skews to that. We focused a little bit on technology, more on how to learn with technology, how to teach with it, rather than particularly as tools. And then we touched on timeline issues, how to go online and stay online, how to time it right without either looking too dangerous or aggressive, and then how to actually get online done right in a very, very short period of time. I mean, I think these are all vital, vital questions, and I'm very, very glad they've come up so far. Jeff, what do you think? Have we addressed all these questions sufficiently? Have we solved them?
Oh, sure, we solved it. No, I thank you for that highlights reel. I mean, it has, you know, it has given me a lot to think about, and I really appreciate it. I think both the comments in the chat and what was said aloud, and now this cat, seeing the cat on screen is fantastic. But yeah, I think this is one of the things that I struggle with is just almost the tone of just kind of, and where to go. Like, you know, even Sean mentioned, like, well, it's really hard to speculate right now because it's hard to speculate about what's going to happen tomorrow. And so I think, I feel like everybody up here is brave to be trying to be a leader in thinking through what is happening to us right now and what might happen next based on that. And I think it is, you know, these are things that people, you know, the conferences are all kind of canceled for now. I would usually see a lot of you there, probably all of you, as far as Sean and Barb and Noah and Bryan. But this is, you know, there are kind of these other things that are happening instead of it. There are people adjusting. There's like this cloud of this health issue over us as well. And I think people are starting to learn of people that are being impacted by this virus. So I think there's so much that's gonna change that's coloring everything we were talking about. And I'm sort of surprised I have 2 young kids who are in the house. I'm surprised they haven't burst in to the mic, to the screen, to the camera. And I'm guessing of the people that are out there, they probably have maybe little ones running around as well, or cats or dogs, or people are in their home offices unlike what they're used to. So I think it's just so much, and it's just hard to know where to go next. And I just want to thank everybody for being here, for participating. And we will come back next Tuesday, same bat time, same bat channel, and we'll have a roster of new guests. Bryan and I will pose questions to them and get your questions as well. Some of your people that asked questions this week were here last week too. That's really cool. Hope you can join us again next week. And really, we will put up the article with the audio and the video. So if you came in late, you can watch it there, or if you want to share this with others. And thanks everybody for the work you're doing out there. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
And thanks, Bryan.
Stay safe.